message is very, very simple. We want to educate the kids, not indoctrinate them.
She doesn't want these projects in her backyard, in Warringah. She wants them in yours.
What's wrong with Australia today?
For me, it's leadership. There's just a lack of leadership.
We should be energy independent here in Australia. We've got everything.
And it's good to see the community come out and really engage in this issue of parental rights.
You only have one vote, but it's very powerful.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Commanding the Narrative. My name is Steven Tripp, coming to you live on Facebook and Rumble. Unfortunately, we're not coming live on YouTube because YouTube have banned us this week. It doesn't ever make any sense why they do stuff like that. We got this message through the week. It goes back to an interview that we did, believe it or not, on October 2022 with Tony Nikolic. Supposedly, we violated their medical misinformation policy, whatever that is. So if you do normally watch us on YouTube, please jump over to Rumble. Rumble's a far better platform to use. It's advocates for free speech, and we've never had any issues with the Rumble at all. Unfortunately, if you do follow us on YouTube, you won't see us for a week. I can't upload. I can't even change thumbnails. I mean, that's how petty they are. They think that we'll be upset just because we can't change the thumbnails on our YouTube videos. But if you're going to watch this later, you won't be watching this live. But head over to the Rumble. Follow us on Rumble. It's a far better platform, and really support us there. Also, if you're watching us on Instagram, we are live streaming there as well. Unfortunately, Instagram's not integrated with the software that we use with StreamYard. So if you want to comment or if you want to contribute, jump over to the Facebook or the Rumble. The link is in the description of our Instagram profile page. So just click on there and you can find us there if you want to call through or send a message and contribute to this conversation that we're having on today's episode. But before we start, I'll kick things off like I always do by letting you all know about Buy Me a Coffee. Now you can come and support us on Buy Me a Coffee. We had a donation this week from PL Star. He says, thanks to you and your undying efforts, we have a chance of overcoming the enemy within. So, thank you very much to PL Star for sending through that donation. It's much appreciated. It helps pay for the stream and everything like that as well. Also, the T-shirt shop is going well. I got my T-shirts in the mail recently. You can get Commanding the Narrative T-shirts and ex-candidates T-shirts. That's at xcandidates.t-shirts.net.au. I've got my Commanding the Narrative T-shirt right here. Great. I was really impressed with the quality of these T-shirts. It's really fantastic. Blew me away. So if you want to support us, it's another way that you can do that as well. And before we get started, because we've got a big, exciting, interesting interview tonight, we've got also a big event coming up. It's the 2024 Environment and Energy Forum. It's at the DYRSL on Sunday, June 2nd. It's between 1 and 5 p.m. in the afternoon. You can get your tickets now on Eventbrite, and we're going to have some great speakers. Senator Malcolm Roberts from One Nation, Barnaby Joyce from the National Party, and also former Deputy Prime Minister as well. Dr. Peter Ridd, Daniel Wild and Brianna McKee from the Institute of Public Affairs, Tony Irwin, Dr. Mark Ho. Dr. Mark Ho's the president of the Australian Nuclear Association. Professor Stephen Wilson's going to be there. We're going to have a big panel speaking about nuclear energy, which is going to be really great. And a lot of community groups and farmers and rural and regional people that are really facing renewable projects head on. So we're going to have a panel speaking about that as well. Some of them I've already interviewed on Commanding the Narrative, like Greg Piper, Jim Wilmot, and Katie McCallum. So if you want to go to that event, please find that event on Eventbrite. I'll put the link in the description and the show notes as well. If you want to go to that, it should be a great event. So it's coming up very soon. So don't wait to get your tickets, get them now. But on today's episode, I'm going to start off by playing a clip. Now, this group that's popped up is the British Australian community. Frank Salter is behind or part of them. He's a former president. I'm going to bring him on in a moment, but before we do so, I'm going to set the tone by playing one of their YouTube clips, or at least a clip from their YouTube, just so the audience has an idea of what the British Australian community is all about.
The sad part is that most of these new elites are advancing the hateful propaganda which was fed to them through a corrupted education system, which has been enthralled to radical neo-Marxist dogma for decades. For example, the Australian National Museum on its website notes reactions of white Australians to non-white immigration at that time, which were overwhelmingly negative. Yet they do not ask the obvious questions. For instance, if these policies were so popular, then how, why, and by whom were they dismantled? And how did they evade the democratic will of the people? In a true democracy, one would expect the majority will to prevail. They also fail to note that many non-white nations still run racially restrictive immigration policies, but do not criticize these nations for racist attitudes. On the museum's website, they note that white Australians of the time were concerned about lower wages, diseases, corruption, drug abuse, and gambling. Yet these concerns are not addressed or seen as legitimate. Instead, everything is viewed through the lens of minority interests, whilst the wishes of the majority are ignored, trivialized, or denigrated. Why is everything always viewed from the perspective of minorities? In the 21st century, the Chinese can still have and feel proud of the Chinese nation. The Indians can still have and feel proud of the Indian nation. So why can't Australians have and feel proud of their own Australian nation? It's because, until recently, Anglo-Celtic and European Australians had no one to advocate for their interests and to defend the nation. We all assumed that the government was doing that. It wasn't. Our government was captured decades ago by people who hate our guts. The only organisation which has the intellectual firepower to win this battle is the British Australian community.
Okay, so that should set the tone for today's interview. I have with me Frank Salter. He's an academic and researcher. He is the former president of the British Australian community. He's also now active with them as a committee member. He's also the author of the book Anglophobia, and he's published widely in Quadrant magazine. So let's bring him on, Mr. Frank Salter. Welcome to Commanding the Narrative, Frank.
Good to be here, Steve.
So before we really get into things, can you give people maybe just a brief background of your expertise on this matter of because I hear that you're an expert on ethnicity and those sorts of topics.
Yeah, I'm a political scientist, grew up in Parramatta High, trained at Sydney University, undergraduate, and then completed Masters and PhD in Brisbane at Griffith University. Then I realised I had no job prospects in Australia, very poor job prospects, despite my doctoral thesis being published by Oxford University Press, which was great. I was very excited at the time. I thought, a job. No. So I left for the world. I went exploring and ended up in Europe at the Max Planck Society, where I switched in the mid-90s from researching hierarchies, command hierarchies in the military, bureaucracy, that sort of thing, to studying ethnicity. And so I have about 30 years research behind me with several books and peer-reviewed papers, that sort of thing. So it's a typical academic specialty. It's something I have views on. And I, after the year 2000, I became more and more involved in policy analysis. So not just trying to understand ethnicity, but generate policy recommendations to, for example, reduce conflict, reduce the risk of civil war, reduce the risk of societies becoming just unfriendly and cold places compared to nation states. So I began, and one leap forward in that direction, policy analysis, was in 2010. I was still living in Europe, and I was visiting Australia, and I opened the Sydney Morning Herald, and there was an op-ed written by a Melbourne academic arguing for open borders. well, Australia, what would happen? Australia is a very attractive destination for people. There are millions of people around the world who'd love to come to Australia or any first world country with generous welfare and relatively safe compared to their own countries. And I was so furious by this. This op-ed by this academic ignored all the research, all the literature. So I wrote an article for Quadrant, sent it to Quadrant. I thought I have no chance. They published it, and my Quadrant career went from there. So I was drawn into more and more into policy analysis. On returning to Australia in 2011, just the next year, after a few years, I joined the BAC, British Australian Community, and became president for a couple of years, and still am active with them. By the way, they're the next question is going to be, tell us about the BAC.
Well, my question's going to be, why do we need the BAC and what's its purpose?
Well, the reason I joined was that Anglo-Celtic Australians, the people who basically forged the Australian nation and were like 98% of the population until, the post-war World War II era, have no representative bodies. There are no ethnic lobbies explicitly there to represent the interests of Anglo-Australians. And that's partly explains what's happened, which is that we have governments since 1960s and 70s, governments which pay far more heed to minority ethnic interests than to the majority. In fact, they don't pay heed at all. They're actually critical because of a white Australian begins talking about, well, hold on, we're this diversity is bad for us, and we want our true history taught to our children in school, and so on. They're called nasty names. I think we're familiar with the sort of names they're called. The relatively new one is white supremacist, for wanting to survive, for wanting to do what any other people in the world do, which is protect their borders and try to remain the ethnic majority, a super majority. We're called these nasty names. So I joined for that reason.
Well, that's the thing, because I think it's quite reasonable for the BAC to represent on behalf of Anglo-Celtics and other white people. But when I think about the issue, I feel an underlying anxiety, and I can't. Some of it I can explain, other parts of it I can't explain. Why do you think that is? Why do you think people like me would feel an anxiety just for advocating for Anglos or white people?
Well, two explanations. I don't know, but two explanations come to mind. One is you've been indoctrinated, but a more serious one, a more deeper one, which preserves your individuality, is that we are descended from one of the most individualistic cultures and civilizations the world has ever seen. This is one, especially northwestern Europe, where Britain is situated, and colonised Australia. One of the most individualistic cultures. Now, we're capable of tribal thinking. We're capable of group cohesion and so on. Of course, we've proven that because people have volunteered and fought to defend the country in two world wars and so on. But we're relatively mild. And by the way, this runs counter to all the left-wing sociology that's taught at schools and in universities. While white racism has been a scourge and so on. Well, racism is a scourge, but white racism is rare compared to the non-white varieties around the world. And so I think it's natural for an Anglo-Australian, someone from the European tradition, to feel a bit uncomfortable with group talk, talk about group interests and so on. We don't want that. We're an exogamous, outmarrying civilization. We want to include. We want to include, so migrants, we want to assimilate, to enculturate, to become one of us. We don't want to live in, permanently separated. By the way, in some parts of the world, that's not the case. In some parts of the world, for example, in the Middle East, it's called segmentary culture, and they have lived beside each other for millennia without intermarrying and becoming one. That's the way they do ethnicity there. We do ethnicity differently in the West. We want to assimilate. We don't want internal divisions, especially hierarchy. We don't want stratification by ethnicity. One of the most poisonous things, I think, from the Western perspective. So that'd be my guess, is where your feelings are coming from on that.
I remember being in primary school and one of the teachers saying to us, Australia doesn't have a culture because we haven't been around long enough, and we need to import other cultures to build our culture here. And I always thought that was wrong, because I feel like Australia does have a culture. It's more of a subtle culture. We don't ask for too much. We just want people to have a fair go in life, give others a fair go, work hard, obey the law, contribute to society, have morals and ethics, and have good manners and those sorts of things. But we don't ask for too much. You just come here, come to this country and be a good citizen. Do you feel like there's been an effort made to downplay Australian culture?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And it's really sad the way the education system in Australia has been misguided. I think corrupted, actually. From the training of teachers, this is a big factor in it, the training of teachers, to the enforcement of curricula at the state level and at the national level, that really relegate the Australian nation and its genuine roots. Can I just take up your childhood, youthful feeling about Australia? There's a lot of truth in what you say, but it's true. But it's just the surface. What you were doing was observing what you saw around you, your own emotions, and probably what happened in your family and your friends. But in fact, our culture is ancient. Australian culture, Australia, European, British Australia, is thousands of years old. What your teacher meant, what she was saying, what he was saying to you, was culture specific to Australia with no other attachments is very shallow. Historically, it's 250 years old or whatever. But all Australians, including indigenous, especially indigenous Australians, have ancient histories. Now, the core identity group in Australia is British, Anglo-Celtic, I prefer to call it, because Britain is a place. I don't mean that. It's Anglo-Celtic, and modified, of course, with local experience. And also we've been absorbing immigrants, and we've been influenced by the indigenous cultures, a lot of place names, a lot of name of animals and so on. But it's at core, it's an Anglo-Celtic culture, and that's ancient. If you want to understand Australia, for example, say you found a Greek Australian who was typically someone half Greek, or partly Anglo, partly whatever, but you focus on the Greek side of it, and you said to that person, so you're an Australian citizen, so you have no culture really because we've only been here for a couple of hundred years. I think that they would say, on behalf of their Greek ancestry, hold on just a moment. The Greek side of my ancestry goes back to the ancient Greeks, and before that, it goes back millennia. What are you talking about? And of course, the same applies to Italian Australians, to Anglo-Celtic Australians, and so on. So seeing that Anglo-Celts are the largest ethnic group, and for a long time we were the nation. There were 6 colonies, all British, and when they held their meetings to arrange federation, beginning in 1890 and going through. It repeatedly noted, well, one thing that's really going to make this simpler, this process of coming together to form a federated nation, is that we're all the same. We're all Anglos. We're all the same language, same religion, same race, same, it's all there. That is a tremendous. And Sir Henry Parkes, the Premier of New South Wales, who initiated the whole process, made a famous speech in which he said, "The crimson thread of kinship runs through us all." That was at the first federal meeting. The crimson thread of kinship runs through us all. And it's just a statement of fact. Statement of fact. So from 1970, roughly 1970, we've been diversifying. We've been diversifying under the auspices of the White Australia policy from 1949, when we began immigration from other places in Europe. But they generally, those people from Germany and from Scandinavia and from Italy and Greece and so on, they're all within European civilizational bounds and assimilated without changing much our culture. Okay, the food did improve. Yes, cuisine improved. I doff my hat. And they brought their own deep cultures as well. But our core culture remains, despite government policy, it remains Anglo-Celtic. And that's not a new tradition. It's an ancient tradition. And so the British Isles history is our history as well. Magna Carta, Australians, because most Australians have in the process of assimilating into that Anglo-Celtic national core, the Magna Carta becomes part of our collective histories. How dare anyone call that, we have no identity? It's outrageous.
Well, that's the insidious thing. They're getting kids when they're young. And, when I was in primary school, what did I know about any of these issues? So that's how the indoctrination gets in there. And even if you instinctively know that it's wrong, you might not have an argument to be able to present a case against it. So these teachers just have carte blanche to just say whatever they want. And essentially they get away with it. And a lot of these ideas stick in the minds of young people. And another one that's prominent, especially now, is that British settlement only took place on stolen Aboriginal land. And there's this, I guess you might call it white guilt, that the British came here and established their colony on Aboriginal land. Do you think that holds a lot of Anglos back from advocating for their own needs?
I think that argument has worked with a lot of people who've not heard counterpositions and have no institutional defence mechanism. My own, I think, I would say to children who've been indoctrinated with this position that there was no way that Australia was not going to be colonised. Australia's destiny, by Australia, I don't mean the word Australia, which is a European word. So we mapped, named, populated, created Australia, people from Europe, with some indigenous contribution, of course, which should be carefully noted. But to say, we stole the land, no, there was no theft. The British colonisers followed the law of conquest, the law of colonisation, which was international law at that stage. We should know because we created international law. There was no international law before then. There were no rules governing interactions between peoples. That came from our Christian heritage. It came from our European heritage. And over time, one reason that the First Fleet was sent out in a hurry was that Whitehall knew, the British authorities knew that there were other colonial countries out hunting for fresh land as well. And in fact, 4 days after Arthur Phillip arrived with the first fleet, 4 days after they arrived, a French fleet arrived outside Sydney Harbour. It was La Perouse.
Yeah.
Who then went missing and so on. We have a beach named after him. Typical Australian friendliness. We named a beach after him. The Russians were building a land empire going east towards Siberia, and then finally Alaska. They colonized Alaska. There were the French, as I've mentioned. The Dutch were incredibly energetic and already had an empire in the Dutch East Indies, which is became Indonesia. So parts of Australia had already been mapped by Dutch explorers, blown off course. So it was a highly competitive world, and we had a huge piece of valuable real estate with no state ruling over it. It was occupied by 250,000 to 500,000 Aborigines, but they had no unified polity. There were roughly 500 linguistic clans, linguistic groups occupying Australia, and it was just there for the first taker. And in fact, what did Captain Cook do when he came from New Zealand and came across and mapped the east coast of Australia? He just went on shore, raised a flag, and said, "I claim this on behalf of the Crown." So Australia was wide open to being captured, and I think, and I like to think, but I do think it's true, that Aboriginal Australians hit the jackpot when, of all the circling powers, who claimed Australia and grabbed it? The British. Those with democratic parliamentary rule. They were inventing classical liberalism. They were inventing universal rights. They were about 50 years into inventing the Industrial Revolution with a resulting massive wealth that would benefit everybody. And, despite, of course, being colonised really has tragic elements to it, of course. I shouldn't minimise any of that. But just imagine being colonised by the British instead of, say, by the Chinese or the Japanese or the Indonesians or whatever. So I think we should be teaching our children to be proud. Some bad things were done, by the way. And that should be acknowledged, talked about. But there's a lot to be proud of.
Well, what we're getting told now is that there was a genocide that happened, and obviously the left specifically, but some people on the right as well, focus on all the atrocities that happened. But on the Ex-Candidates, which is another podcast that I do on this platform, we interviewed an Aboriginal elder called Kerry White, and she said on the podcast, "White fellas saved us." She said, when the British were setting up the missions, a lot of Aboriginal women would go to those missions just to get away from their own communities where they were facing a lot of hardship. And she went into some graphic detail of what was happening to those Aboriginal women, but that doesn't get talked about a lot. And and you only have to walk through Sydney. So if you're walking through Circular Quay in Sydney and you see the Harbour Bridge and you see the Opera House and you see all the big buildings and everything like that, and if you really step back and think, all this was created in 250 years or whatever it might. I mean, it's incredible when you really think about
it's amazing
what the British brought to this country from where it was. What are some of the positives that the British did bring to the Aboriginal communities?
By mid-century, 19th century, so roughly 1850, Aboriginal men, because there was not yet the female vote, Aboriginal men were voting in New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Tasmania. Queensland and Western Australia would come later, but there were historical reasons. They were the two main frontier states, and relations are more difficult there. So Aboriginal men were voting in Australia before British men got the vote.
Wow.
There was universal suffrage in 1918, as late as 1918, and the Australian colonies always saw themselves as culturally progressive, as pushing the boundaries of liberty and you know, an enlightened government, and they included indigenous people in that process. So that's one obvious benefit, to be part of a nation that's a democracy. So yes, we've just been conquered or colonized. I prefer the word annexed. Yes, we've been annexed, but look what we've got. We're part of this community, and we're voting. Let's add a couple of other things they should be really happy about. English was set to become the world language of commerce and science. Aborigines are part of that. Indigenous Australians are part of that. They weren't colonised by a culture destined for the scrap heap of history. It was the opposite. The British Empire already was strong and was to become the largest empire ever known. A quarter of the land surface, all around the world, controlled. You know, like it or not, that's an achievement. That's an extraordinary achievement. And that empire was a trading empire and formed the basis of modern globalization, of which Aborigines now are part of. They're part of that. They in effect leapfrogged their natural civilizational development by millennia, by several thousands of years, as which viewed the initial culture shock was considerable, of course. That's not good, but after a while, the end result is spectacular. They didn't have to invent the steam engine. They didn't have to develop writing. They didn't have to develop mathematics, and on and on. It was just handed to them, actually, handed to them. They handed a lot to us, by the way, so I'm not suggesting it was all one way. What they handed us was overwhelmingly country, that land. There was a tremendous contribution from them of land, which we should always remember. Children should be introduced to that. And they introduced familiarity with the land, love of place, knowledge of place. You know, that I think that has been a background factor in European Australia becoming to be attached to the Australian continent. I think the Aborigines of Indigenous people in general have played a role in that, for sure. But there's a lot for them to be grateful for.
And a lot of that positive stuff doesn't get talked about. I mean, a lot of the Aboriginal people were working with the British and teaching them about the land and what foods to eat, and helping them explore the land as well. And we know that I think it's about 60% of Aboriginal people intermarry with white people. So there's a lot of commingling, and it's not all about death and genocide and those sorts of things. There are tremendous positives. And when you think about where the Aboriginal people came from in 1788, when the first fleet arrived, they were essentially a tribal hunter-gatherer people. And then in maybe 100 or 150 years' time, they're flying aeroplanes and driving cars and becoming doctors.
Yes.
I mean, it's incredible just to look at the evolution of the Aboriginal people from that point to where we are now. It really is an incredible journey for them.
And those negatives, let me say something else about the negative aspects, like being driven off their land, losing control of their own destiny and so on. The culture shock and the demographic shock would have been considerable. So just recognizing that. But it's not all these painful episodes were not limited to them. Let's now look at British history, and because of England's centrality in Britain, I'll just talk about England. Going back and looking at the history, the long history of England's rise and then Britain's rise, there's a lot of unpleasantness there as well. Like, for example, the first inhabitants of England were hunter-gatherers, small in number because they're hunter-gatherers. You can't sustain many people from hunting and gathering. And they were largely replaced, basically just absorbed, just wiped out, in effect, one way or the other, by Neolithic farmers who came about 4,000 BC. Those Neolithic farmers then grew rapidly in numbers to about 100 times their population. That's what happens when hunting and gathering is replaced by farming. The population rises about 100-fold. That culture then built Stonehenge. So Stonehenge was a result of that. But they were not destined to become modern Brits. They were basically displaced by the Belgica people who came from northern Europe, further north in Europe, came across the Channel, and they had copper smelting and copper working. And each of these changes marked a jump in technological ability, right? Because that's why they could invade. They could invade because they had the technology to do so. They had better weapons. They were typically larger in numbers as well, because, with technology goes more food production, therefore larger numbers. So the Neolithic farmers were almost wholly displaced and replaced by the Belgica people who came in. They then became, through cultural change, they became the Celtic population of Britain, which was then, invaded by the Romans, brought under Roman control. And when the Romans left about 450 AD, they were taken over again and largely displaced, not completely, but largely displaced by Anglo-Saxons, Germanic peoples, Germanic tribes coming across, militarily superior, and conquered them and forced them to the periphery, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, this sort of thing, pushed them and dominated England. So this is it's not a bed of roses, I often hear it said by Aboriginal people who are proud of being Aboriginal, which is fine. I often hear it said, we're the longest continuous culture in the world, the longest living continuous. For 50,000 years we've had the same culture. Personally, I don't believe it. I think that Australia's been much more dynamic than that. But by their own admission, it's been relatively static compared to, say, Britain. That short history I just gave of England shows there were again and again traumatic changes taking place, each time not ratcheting up the technological level. And that same experience was then visited on indigenous Australia from 1788, when a vastly technologically superior culture arrived. Geoffrey Blainey, the great Australian historian Geoffrey Blainey has written that about this culture shock, this incredible shock of these two cultures meeting at Sydney Cove in 1788, January the 26th. And he said a people who had just invented the first steam engine, that's the English, they just invented the first steam engine to pump out their mines and so on, were face to face with the people who didn't know how to boil water. That dramatic, that just extraordinary. And it's turning out, I think, very well for Indigenous Australians, because they're living in a liberal democracy. They've got the vote. They are serving in Parliament. There are at least 10 people of Indigenous descent serving in Parliament now, in the national Parliament, not counting the state parliaments.
Yeah. And mind you, there's a lot of those Aboriginal leaders and politicians that say similar things, that the Aboriginal people probably should embrace more Western culture and be grateful for the opportunities that they now have since the British came in. I know Warren Mundine talks along those lines, where he says Aboriginal people need to move away from that hunter-gatherer mentality and move more into starting up businesses and getting involved economically and really bettering themselves that way. So it's really a mindset. I mean, it's really a struggle between the victimhood mentality and integrating with your surroundings. I mean, how damaging is this victim mentality on any group, whether it be Aboriginal people or any group in society?
I think it does tend to quell creativity, exploration, having a go. I think it does hurt that. There are other dimensions to the indigenous disability that should be mentioned. One is this: as a hunter-gatherer culture, they were intimately connected to the land. Okay, and then we come along, a highly mobile people. We're used to, moving around Australia, living in different parts of Australia, going overseas for several years, as I did, coming back again. Right, where I love Australia. I love Australia's beaches and sweeping plains, and I'm almost getting poetic here, but my connection to the land is not as intense as the indigenous Aboriginal attachment. So that creates a problem in the modern world. A lot of Aborigines want to remain where they were born. They want to remain in their culture. They want to remain in country. And I sympathise, but the result is we have hundreds of communities with no real economic logic. Why would they be there? Now, I understand why they want to be there, but from an modern economic perspective, what are they doing there? There's no farms, there's no factories, there's no jobs, there's no. So it's difficult, and I'm just describing the issue. I don't have an answer for it. But there's a tension there, and I can understand both sides. The Australian taxpayers, people who represent taxpayers, are saying, listen, this is hugely expensive for taxpayers to provide, medical services, welfare services, and so on, provide teachers and all the rest of it. Very expensive for us to do that. Wouldn't it be more efficient if they just moved to functioning towns? That makes sense from their point of view, but from the Aboriginal point of view, it's not so simple. They love their way of life, of course. So there are difficulties to be worked out, and with goodwill, I think we can do that. And and just one final point on that, I think there's a continuing appetite among non-Aboriginal Australians to help. That we're spending something like $30 billion a year. The budget for Indigenous Australian welfare and so on, education, medicine, is comparable to that of our defence expenditure. It's comparable, a bit less now. It's massive. I don't see a way of simply abandoning that. I don't think we should be contemplating that. Reducing, trimming where we can, yes. There are hundreds of programs, and very few of them have actually been evaluated for effectiveness and efficiency. That's right.
How many of these get audited? I mean, John's made a comment in the chat. Who actually makes the money out of these initiatives? I mean, there's billions of dollars being floating around, but it doesn't seem to get on the ground to the community. So it's a big issue. I do want to move away because, we've got other big topics to talk about as well. I want to move across to immigration and this term multiculturalism. Do you agree with the term? So for my view of it is I don't particularly agree with the term multiculturalism, because the way that I interpret that is that that's many cultures coming together and trying to interact with each other. Whereas I think you need an overarching culture for a nation. you can have races or multiple races in that nation, but you need an overarching culture, which is and part of that culture is your ethics and your laws and et cetera, to keep the cohesion of that nation together. What are your views on all of that? What are your views on multiculturalism versus a multiracial society?
Right, huge question. Big topic. Let's just begin with the meaning of words. So there's no real strict definition of what multiculturalism is. There are official statements made about it, which can be ludicrous, like, the government will say, we are officially multicultural, and that means that you must love Australia and blah, 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 blah. Well, humans don't live by government edict. Humans live by their own needs, their own goals, their own ambitions, their own culture. So multiculturalism means different things to different people. I think a lot of people in the centre, especially centre-left, there's a lot of fine Australians, they just take it to mean just getting along, just respecting people. Obviously, it would involve counteracting any white racism, any Anglo-racism, bigotry and so on, keeping that in check. That perspective would generally supports these Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Commission, for example, which is specified by the United Nations treaties. And from that perspective, it all makes sense. We just need to get along. And then there's the reality of multiculturalism, and which is my approach as a political scientist. I'm interested in power and policy-making ability. What actually produces, to my mind, multiculturalism is an example of an ethnic policy. It's an ethnic policy. Immigration, it bears on ethnicity. It's another policy area. Indigenous affairs deals with Indigenous relations and so on. Well, so does multiculturalism. And the way I look at it is there is a position, there is a literature in the political science literature which sees multiculturalism as an ethnic hierarchy, has an element of ethnic hierarchy in it. So it's a reverse ethnic hierarchy. Reversing what? Well, reversing what is normal in a country, which is that the founding group, especially in a democracy, the majority group, right, which should be running things, goes normally that the founding ethnic group, it runs things. It's privileged. Why? Because it created the state in the first place. The Commonwealth in our case, it created it so it tends to have strong influence over selecting migrants, and whoever can select the migrants is selecting the long-term demographic future of a country. Obviously, especially if the country, such as Australia, is bringing in large numbers of people, typically 1% of the population growing. Right, we have immigration has been at since the beginning of this century under the Howard Liberal government. Immigration has been about 1% of the population per year. Massive. That's massive. That's replacement level immigration. Replacement if they're different people. So I see multiculturalism as a type of ethnic policy that reverses the normal ethnic hierarchy, right? So and it puts minorities on top, and that opinion is well reflected in that opening clip that you showed, that video clip, where Harry Richardson was explaining, look, we're living in a society where minorities basically are on top, and majority, our majority, is at the bottom, and one can add to that, yes, these multicultural agencies such as the Human Rights Commission target. What do they target? Not racism, they're targeting white racism. Why are children taught these lies in the schools, these corrupted messages about our history? they're not insulting Greeks or Chinese or immigrant. They're never insulted at school. It's the Anglo-Celtic majority that's insulted, whose history is defamed, really. So that these are sorts of things, sort of aggression that you expect from a hierarchy. And the BAC believes that if there's going, I don't think, we don't feel comfortable with any such hierarchy. There shouldn't be such a hierarchy in society. If there's going to be a hierarchy in a democracy, the majority should be on top. The majority should be dictating the thrust of immigration policy and internal ethnic policy and so on. And that's simply not happening. And the result will be, in another generation, Anglo-Australians will be a minority in their own country, in the country that their ancestors built.
You mentioned replacement, and this might be my indoctrination speaking here, but do you think there's a certain level of hypocrisy from, say, the Anglos to say, well, we're worried about replacement from immigration, other cultures coming in and replacing us, but essentially the British were the ones that replaced the Aboriginal people here to begin with. Do you feel there is a hypocrisy there, or would you explain it differently?
Double standard, I'd say. I'd reframe the question in terms of, is there a double standard or not? Because hypocrisy, I don't think, hypocrisy implies consciousness. I'm consciously adopting a double standard for my own advantage, and it's a form of aggression. Has there been a double standard? Well, possibly, yeah. Identity politics. This is what we're talking about. Identity politics. It's full of double standards. And from our moral perspective, we might perceive that from our moral perspective. But our vantage point in making that judgment is we're sitting on Mount Olympus, looking down at humans as ants and saying, oh, that tribe, we'll call it tribe A, has occupied the lands of tribe B, and now they're worried about defending their own territory against tribe C. How hypocritical of them! What a double standard! This is very, very pure morality. It's Mount Olympus type morality. But what if one instead takes the vantage points of some of these groups, right? Some of these groups. Well, the first question is, what is good for my family? What is good for my ethnic group? And it's, history led to an Anglo-Celtic nation and then a European nation on Australia's shores, very successful. And that happened through people just doing what they thought would help them survive and was right and so on. People just with their own, taking their own parochial perspective. What else are they supposed to do? Think about the global perspectives of colonising Parramatta. No, they just colonised Parramatta, or built a farm here, or built a bridge there, or built a road there. Right. So we are necessarily parochial if we're going to get anything done. And that led to a tremendously successful nation, the Australian nation. We're trying to work through our difficulties, the problems, the issues posed by having an indigenous population, as we've been discussing. But that doesn't mean that Anglo-Australia does not have interests. It doesn't mean that Anglo-Australia is wrong to seek to survive and remain, autonomous in charge of its own government. So I think if one is to be fair, it's legitimate and reasonable for Anglo-Australians to want to keep their country, in other words.
Got a comment here from Struth Dundee, which is a fantastic name. It's an interesting name, at least. He's commenting on Rumble. He says, we never voted or asked for mass immigration or multiculturalism. Now, I remember hearing from my grandparents who have passed away since, but they always talked about how great Australia used to be, and it's not so much. Since Gough Whitlam, it's changed, and it's not as great as it used to be, and to a lesser extent, my parents would say the same thing, and I think it's something that's a part of every generation. They always look back. Even I look back at the 90s and think how great it was. There's something almost biological in us to look back and think about how great our upbringing was, and everything's changed for the worse. But in talking about moving Australia away from the White Australia policy to a more an immigration policy where we're promoting multiculturalism, was that ever taken to an election? Was it ever voted on by the Australian people, where the majority of Australian people supported that policy?
No, it was never, and explicitly so. So, two prime ministers in particular, Malcolm Fraser, 1975 to 1983, and then the next prime minister, Bob Hawke, and the Keating government followed on from that until the mid-90s. They both explicitly stated that mass non-European immigration would not have happened if the Australian people had been given a choice. Now, this, in other words, what they confirmed what I was just saying, that Australia is a reverse ethnic hierarchy with the majority and founding ethnic group firmly on the bottom and kept down by mainstream media, the education system, the university system, now the corporate sector. For some reason, Australia's elites want to replace the historic Australian nation with a new nation, with a new society. And democracy does not fit into it. It does not fit in. Bob Hawke said, the only reason we could open the borders for mass non-European immigration was because there was no vote. And Malcolm Fraser said in his memoirs, he said, Australians should never be given a choice on immigration because they always get it wrong. They always get it wrong. Groups, you can throw any immigrants at the Australian nation, though in the end they'll absorb them and celebrate them. And where's the problem? So with leaders like that, who needs enemies?
But doesn't it debase their own power structure to bring in foreign people, especially if they don't come from systems of democracy or how we have here a constitutional monarchy? Like if they're coming from, say, communist countries or just authoritarian countries, doesn't that debase the power structure here by having an influx of people that might not agree with your governmental structure?
I think it's assumed by these politicians that that immigrants will be subject to the same indoctrination processes, the same enculturation, processes as Australians. That Australia is so rich, we're so successful that basically we can absorb anyone. And added to that is has been an attempt by both sides of politics, beginning with the Labor Party, to attract minority votes. So what is democratic politics? Excuse me, I have to cough. Democratic politics, in a way, is like a business. What you're trying to attract is not dollars, but votes. And it was felt by the Labor Party, and they began this process, that they could win the ethnic vote, for example, by having as immigration minister Al Grasby, for example. Al Grasby was a champion of minority rights, a critic of Anglo-Australia. He was immigration minister under Gough Whitlam, 1972 to 1975. Now, he didn't last the final year. And then the Labor Party got the idea, there's real votes to be gained here, because as the immigrant community grew, it became more and more profitable politically to attract their votes. So then another factor is lobbies. Because Australians are so European Australians are so individualistic, we haven't tended to build these lobbies that lobby government to get our own way in immigration policy, multicultural policy, and so on. So these ethnic lobbies are really influential, and they've been overwhelmingly on the left. They use rhetoric to make themselves sound left-wing, but in fact they're tribalists. They're somewhere to the right of Attila the Hun, because they're ethnic activists. So it's a bit galling to have them point at white Australia and say, "Oh, you're white supremacists and you're racists and all the rest of it." We're nothing compared to them. They've been an empowering engine of multiculturalism, which is minority rights, minority privilege too. So I think it's the democratic process itself has contributed to this, but the third factor, which I mentioned earlier, was elites. So the multiculturalism could not have got started if it were not for leftist cultural elites, for example, running the media, running the universities, running, therefore, the school curricula, influencing teacher training and so on. And more recently, the big corporations, for some reason, have got it into their heads to adopt a globalist left-wing approach. So those elites have treated ethnic minorities as, no, there's a word I'm looking for, as clients. They're like clients. That combination of elite power plus their minority clients has been irresistible. And I think it's been irresistible around the world, especially in the Anglosphere countries. It's been a winning formula. The question is, can the model be broken? Is there a way of breaking that model?
Well, essentially, the toothpaste is out of the bottle already. We've already seen large levels of immigration into Australia, to the point where, sometimes you're walking down the streets of some of these communities, and, we used to play a game at school called Spot the Aussie. As in, an Aussie would be essentially a white person, because it would be overwhelmingly Chinese or Vietnamese or Lebanese, or there's a lot of groups that are congregated together, and in those areas there's not many white people to be seen. When we're talking about this issue of immigration, is it past the point now where you can't reverse it? Like, do we just need to accept it how it is now?
Look, I think my approach to that is a very good question. My approach is, yes, we've been diversified, substantially diversified. We're not the homogeneous country we once were, but that doesn't mean that we don't have interests. And that doesn't mean that there are not only the interests of Anglo-Celts to be considered, but of the nation as a whole. For example, diversity is simply a bad thing to have. In a little diversity might be fine, bring you some cuisine, as we were saying earlier, some cultural, some culture, but diversity is correlated with all sorts of social problems. Social cohesion and diversity do not go together. This has happened around the world. This is something I've studied and published on over the last 30 years. So our governments should have known. They should have known this. They were maybe not the politicians, but the senior public servants have no excuse. They should have known the research. The Australian nation was built on that assumption. The White Australia policy was not a supremacist policy. It was an anti-diversity policy. It was all about assimilation. How do we get new migrants to rapidly assimilate? Well, you choose migrants who come from similar cultures where assimilation is is natural. It's just a natural thing to, and it doesn't much hurt either side's identity because they're so similar. The idea goes back to the mid-19th century, for heaven's sake. So, so from the late 20th century, there was no excuse for not knowing that.
Is a big answer for, if we do talk about the toothpaste being out of the bottle, that we can't reverse the people that have come here. We are a lot more intermixed now, and there are different cultures here and different races. Is the answer assimilation? And I think essentially there's a reverse assimilation going on as well. Like, I speak from my own experience. I grew up in Ashfield and then in Petersham, so inner west of Sydney, very multicultural areas. A lot of my friends were Sri Lankan, Filipino, Lebanese, Greek. I had friends from all over the world, and a lot of those people have assimilated into our culture, and a lot of them are probably more Aussie than a lot of people going around. Is that the answer? If we focus more on assimilation of these people and saying, okay, you're going to come to this country, but this, obviously first is speaking English and blah, 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 blah. How important is assimilation, or is that an argument that the other side are using that you don't agree with?
I think assimilation is inevitable over time. It can be accelerated, it can be retarded, but the process, once people are living within the same state, the same country, assimilation tends to happen naturally. I've heard this argument about toothpaste being outside the container. I've heard that for a long time, and if minorities had taken that advice, there'd be no multicultural industry. Imagine coming to a country and, your Greek immigrants or your Italian immigrants or your German immigrants or your Lebanese immigrants, and you come in such large numbers, you become 1% of the population. That's typical in Australia, 1 or 2% of the population, and then we move on to other sources of immigrants. From that perspective, it'd be reasonable to argue, what possible effect could we have on politics? It's ridiculous. We're 1% of the population, or whatever, 1.5%. But no, they haven't done that. They've represented their dignity and their interests, and they've put their hand up and said, well, we do want to be considered, and we will vote for, in electorates where we have larger representation, we will vote for friendlier candidates than unfriendly candidates. That's all. I find that quite reasonable. They didn't give up. And of course, over time, that interest can drift away as they assimilate. That's the reason assimilation is such an important tool, an important outcome for societies, because it does tend to produce a unity. But while their identities survive, with the historical memories and maybe a racial difference in appearance, which tends to disappear with assimilation, with intermarriage, while that identity survives, I think it's reasonable for ethnic groups to look out for themselves, to make sure that their interests are being at least paid respect. And I think it's reasonable. And if it's all right for them, why not the majority, the people who have founded the country and are still in the majority? Where's the problem? We're not out harming people. We're just out doing what they've always done, which is look after their interests. So if it's good for the gander, why not the goose?
I think the overall percentage of white people in the world is about 7%. So by mass, white people, are underrepresented. Wouldn't it be in our strategic? Wouldn't it be to our strategic benefit to bring more people into the country and then trying to assimilate them to our way of being? Would that make us stronger? Strength by numbers type of approach, where we try and assimilate more and more people into, an Australian way of life, an Australian way of thinking, an Australian way of being. Because there are a lot of countries out there that are authoritarian and they may be communist or fascist or whatever it might be, whereas we are pretty much a liberal democracy, a constitutional monarchy here. Is there any part of that argument that you would agree with?
My main problem with that argument is that the central logic fails. I think mass immigration, populate or perish, that was the slogan after World War II. And I understand the motives. Both sides of politics got together and said, listen, 6 million is just not enough to hold the continent. Well, now we're 25, 26 million. And also we're part of a partly rules-based international order where our closest ally, the United States, is the world's most powerful actor. And even if, as China rapidly rises to parity, it might take another half century for it to have a dozen aircraft carrier fleets and so on. Even when that happens, America will be a massive power. We don't need a large population, and it's been assumed again by the usual suspects, Malcolm Fraser, Bob Hawke, and I think the present government. We must get larger. No, the logic's false. We can never catch up with Indonesia. We can never catch up with India. I mean, even noticeably catch up. It's ridiculous. If we went from 25 million to, say, 40 million, we opened our borders and let people flood in and said, now you've got to be good Australians, you've got to assimilate, and now we've got 40 million people. So what's the difference compared to China? 1.4 billion people. India, roughly the same, 1.4 billion. It's ridiculous. It's a fool's errand. We should be focusing on social cohesion and on demographic stability because it's a fragile continent we have. It's a fragile continent. I think a genuine Greens position has some plausibility to it. Why should Sydney become a 10 million monstrosity? Why should any city do that? I think the basic logic of the population and perish dogma has passed its use-by date.
Got a comment here from Water Sprinkles, and I love the creative names that are coming through off the Rumble, but Water Sprinkles says, problems in schools. New teachers are immigrants and teaching their cultural norms. 30% of students immigrants. Imagine schools 80% immigrants, both teachers and students. How do you integrate as Australians?
You don't. They begin to integrate us. I think a long-term problem faced by Australia will be how do we not get sucked into the vortex, the demographic, cultural, political vortex presented by China has the strongest right now. There's a massive economy. But India's catching up. Again, well over 1 billion people each. Indonesia, the largest Islamic country in the world, is it 200 million? It's a large population. How does little Australia, how do we avoid basically being absorbed? And I think immigration controls will be vital for that.
Got another question.
Yeah.
So, from Watta. How much blame should be put on liberal whites versus Jews when it comes to the cause of this mess?
I don't know. I can't answer that in any simple way. I think the basis of that question is the observation, which is a true observation, is that Jewish Australians, as the Jewish tradition elsewhere, overseas, United States, Britain, and so on, are centre left to, somewhere politically on the left. That's well known. But as to comparing the weight of that influence with left-wing Anglos, I really can't say. But I think we should be open to discovering what the cause of this has been. I've named some of the causes: the corporate sector not business, but large business, multinational businesses seem to have been taken over by this globalist ideology of doing away with borders in order to maximise market share and so on. And then there are there's a left-wing ideology, which has been in my view, the most important factor in motivating the open borders policy in Australia. And then there's minority activists as well. So, but as for rating them, giving them a percentage figure, I'm not able to do that.
Well, if we take everything that you've said into account, and maybe this ties in with what you're trying to achieve with the British Australian community, we had a predominantly white society before, when we had the White Australia policy. And then, as you said, you had politicians like Malcolm Fraser and Bob Hawke, and I'm going to throw in Gough Whitlam as well, that basically took the decision away from the Australian people. And as you said, Malcolm Fraser even said that the Australian people shouldn't have the decision on immigration. That decision's been taken away from the Australian people. What hope do we have now to reverse the trend on immigration? And what do you hope that the British Australian community can do to assist with that?
Well, we're doing our best to lobby. We don't have the ear of any political party. We'll do our best. Our big effort for the last 6 months or so has been producing videos, and I recommend people go into YouTube, especially, also TikTok, and just have a search. Type in British Australian community, and you'll get maybe 50 videos coming up on different topics, different speeches, and so on. We're trying to put our case forward, and I think these videos are one way to do that. But there's more we can do. So we have an election coming up, a federal election coming up next year. I think this will be a new departure for the BAC, but I think we need to. We should have a look at influencing that as we can. For example, through producing videos to urge people to stand up for themselves and not just be, have Australia transformed against their will.
I guess to finish up, what if you were in control of the education system? What are some of the achievements of Australia that you would focus on that we've achieved over the last 250 years? Well,
the starting point before that is I just teach history as it happened. Truth is really important, and young people are being lied to. They're watching movies with multicultural Elizabethan, the British monarchs being multicultural and all this sort of thing. So the falsification of our history has reached a high level. But I think just by being truthful in the history and balanced in the history we teach, a lot of achievements will naturally emerge. Here we have European Australia became part of the British trading network and then the global trading network, where the Australian nation was an outgrowth of Western civilization. That's just a fact, with British characteristics. Western civilization with British characteristics. That's something. It's just a fact, whether one is proud of it or not, because a lot of the students who learn that will not be of Anglo descent, Anglo-Celtic descent, or maybe they'll be half and so on, as Australia assimilates. But the truth should be taught. The truth should be taught. And I just think my vision for the BAC is that just by being there and just speaking truth to power, just quietly chipping away and just saying, hold on a moment, correcting that error, correcting this error, we will have an effect on the political culture of the country, and people will become more aware of true history and also what their interests are. Is it in Australia's interest to become ever more diverse, or are there costs? Well, people should know that there are costs, and they can be severe.
What about the cost to you personally? You've been speaking about this sort of stuff for a long time. I can imagine specifically the left side of politics would come after you and attack you. Have you experienced any of that yourself?
Oh, just a little. Luckily, I've been retired for several years now. I remember when I published this book on genetic interests. This was something where a big event for me, because my science came directly up against political correctness. And I thought, this is going to be a nightmare. This is going to be really difficult, but I must tell the truth.
Yeah.
How long can we spend our lives fudging and dodging and weaving and so on? I just wanted to state the truth as I saw it. And the central fact motivating that book was that I discovered, I was working for a biology institute in Europe, and I was speaking to geneticists and so on and looking at the evidence. I discovered that ethnic groups are extended families, genetic families. So that is simply denied or ignored, or just mainly ignored by the mainstream political science establishment. But for me, it's very interesting, and I think it's relevant to interests, to adds to ethnic interests. So I published this book on genetic interests in 2003, and the roof did not fall in. Okay, I lost some academic positions. My chance of getting a position in an Australian university went from slight to zero, I would say, at that stage. But nevertheless, life went on. I found a way. And I'd recommend that to people. That now, what's happening in the world now is a reason to have courage, because there's a massive reaction happening, and it has been for the last 10 years or so, and it's getting stronger and stronger against these elites that just want to just globalize Western nations, and don't care about the welfare of the nations. They're profit motivated, they're ideologically motivated, and we need to just speak up. And even small voices multiplied a millionfold can be powerful.
I tell people the exact same message, because I hear a lot of people say, what can I do? I mean, I can't influence politics. I'm just one person. I can't do anything. And my journey, I stepped up during the pandemic because I didn't agree with what was happening there. And I expected the same. I expected a lot of pushback and a lot of hatred, and I didn't really cop too much of it. It was surprising. People just let you be a lot of the time. I think a lot of people respect conviction, even if they don't agree with it. If someone can mount a credible argument, like you've done today, I mean, I'm sure there's people that may be watching this who might not agree with you, but I'm sure that they see that you're expressing yourself in a balanced and a rational sort of way. I think people respect that and can resonate with that, even if they don't agree. So I think you should never self-censor. I don't think you should ever hide away from the political process. People need to get active. People need to get involved. And it is surprisingly easy a lot of the time. I mean, there are certain things like getting elected to Parliament is hard, and there's aspects of the political game that is difficult, but some of it is surprisingly easy, and it just takes everyday people with conviction to get involved and get active. And I think this could be one of the main reasons why we have the problems that we do in this country, because a lot of people feel consumed by their everyday lives, or they may be self-censoring that they don't get involved. Do you feel that that people do need to get involved more in the political process?
Yes, and I agree with you. Absolutely. I think just doing something rather than nothing can have a huge impact. We need to think in terms of numbers. That may not be true with one individual, but with 100,000 individuals, it could transform the political situation. You know that the mainstream political parties are quite small. They've been losing members for decades.
Yeah, I think the Liberals are at 11,000 members.
They're right down to 11,000 people. Say there's something similar to the Labor Party and the Greens and so on. So maybe 30,000 people are running politics in Australia. It's ridiculous. So get involved. But for me, the starting point was the reason I came late to this is I wanted to get the science right first before I knew where to put my efforts. It's a responsible thing to do in a democracy, to get involved in politics, to play your role. It's your civic duty to be involved in politics, as long as you're democratic and you're reasonable about it. Learn what your interests are. My advice is to people: learn what your interests are. And when it comes to ethnicity and kinship and these sorts of values, I discern 3 levels, which is the family, and intuitively true, right? We have an interest in the welfare of our children and our cousins and our parents and so on. So there's family, and then there's ethnic group. There can be some intermediates here, but let's just keep it simple. Then there's the ethnic group, and we have an interest in our ethnic group. It's not everything. It's not everything, but we do have an interest. For example, because of ethnic kinship, we have a reproductive interest in our ethnic groups. Because of our ethnic groups decline, the copies of our genes in the country decline as well. So we have an ethnic interest, and then we have larger interests. We might be religious. We belong to a religious community, and then humans at large we have an interest in the welfare of humans at large. That's a global interest. We want a stable international situation. We don't want atrocities and wars and starvation and so on. So that's an interest as well. And different people's political orientation can be defined by how they emphasize those 3 levels. So the left tends to focus on the large universal standards, which is not simply wrong. It's not simply wrong. If it's wrong, it's a matter of balance, maybe. And then there are people who just focus on their family or just focus on their religion, the welfare of their religious group. The BAC is in the middle of that, where we've set ourselves the target of defending the interests of Anglo-Celtic Australians. Okay, but at the same time, of course, we acknowledge that there is other interests as well, and all ethnic groups have an interest in dignity, in not being defamed, and that is because in other words, the status of their ethnic groups. They all have an interest in that, and so we just want to join that committee of ethnic groups in Australia. After all, that's what multiculturalism is meant to be. It's not meant to be for everyone except Anglo-Celtic Australians. It's meant to be for everyone. So let's do that.
And maybe finish up just by telling people about the British Australian community. How do people get involved? What are your plans for the future? And do you host events, or is it can people be interactive in the group? Just let people know about the BAC.
If you'd like to join, joining is automatic as community members. You just go to our website, which is the BritishAustralianCommunity.com.au. go to the membership, click on the membership page. It's $25. It's automatic, less for students, pensioners, and so on. Membership's automatic. Then we have working groups working on different projects, and where our numbers are, by the way, accelerating over the last year. Gone from, it was really a declining organisation until recently, and quite old. The BAC began in 1967 in Melbourne, and was it was just helping British immigrants integrate, find jobs and places to live and that sort of thing. But now this new ethnic defence orientation is picking up, and people are paying attention, and we're still small, very small, but growing. And we're in the process of organising face-to-face meetings so people can get together and be involved in different activities. And as I was saying earlier, we have a federal election coming up sometime next year, probably. This is an opportunity for the BAC to show its presence.
Well, I look forward to seeing what you guys can come up with. And I should apologise. Someone in the chat corrected me, and they said it should be Dr. Frank Salter. So I do apologise for not introducing you correctly. But just maybe a bit of fun to finish up. If you could invite 3 people to dinner, and they could be living or dead, who would you choose?
Oh, so a non-confrontational meeting over dinner.
Well, it could be confrontational. I mean, it just depends on who you want to speak to and maybe get their perspective off.
Well, keeping it relevant to today's discussion, I'd like to get together John Stuart Mill, one of the most famous English philosophers or British philosophers, his acolyte, Sir Henry Parkes. And I'm wondering who the third person would be. Maybe the present King of England. That'd be nice, Charles. And let's have a chat over kangaroo steak about how they all fit together, because that John Stuart Mill, that philosopher, inspired the White Australia policy, what became known as the White Australia policy. That wasn't its name. It was the Immigration Restriction Act 1901. So I'd be interested to see these 3 people from very different perspectives, but with overlapping beliefs. Maybe not the king. Maybe not.
And then you could be there just stirring the pot.
I'd be stirring the kangaroo pot for sure.
Yeah. Well, look, Dr. Salter, thank you very much for coming on today. It's been a very interesting discussion. As I said, I had more questions for this interview than I have had for any other interview that I've done. And I think we could probably talk about a whole host of other issues as well. So hopefully I can have you back on again in the future. And, thank you for answering my questions when, the more provocative questions, you didn't hold back, and you answered every question that I had. So thank you for that. And look, I do agree that there does need to be a group out there that does advocate for Anglo-Australians. Whether you like it or not, these people need to be represented as well. So it's going to be interesting what the British Australian community can do and what they can achieve. And just watching your videos, they're very high quality. And they're very thought-provoking, and I think everyone should take the time to check out what you guys are doing on YouTube and Instagram. And there's a high production value there, and it's good to see whether you agree with it or not. And as I said before, like there's going to be a lot of people out there that don't agree with everything that you're saying, whether that just be an emotional response or an academic response. But I think there is a place for the British Australian community, as there are for other ethnic multicultural groups as well. And maybe you should explain that as well, just as to finish up. The BAC is registered as a multicultural group, is that right?
No, we're incorporated as an educational group in Victoria. So
okay.
So we're incorporated. So it's Inc. It's British Australian Community Inc. Incorporated. But if people want to get I should have said this earlier, if people want to get an idea of where we're coming from and our arguments and our complaints and so on, I'd recommend 2 books, 3 actually. The first is A New Britannia, and that's written by Alan James. And this is, I think it's selling on Amazon. Then there's a book written by the current president, Harry Richardson, and myself, and that's called Anglophobia, the Unrecognised Hatred. Anglophobia, and that book is beginning to have an influence and it's being read overseas as well, by the way. So there's some new. It's not so much new research material, but the combination is fresh, the combination of material. So I think that's interesting. And we have a book, a small book, just published 2 or 3 days ago on the voice referendum. Now, people might think, oh, but the referendum's over and the good guys won, and so where's the problem? Well, the book gives an insight into this issue that has deeper ramifications. The problem of the indigenous complaints and indigenous demands for really separation in many ways and for extra funding and so on will not go away. It's a long-term matter. We need to get it. We need to get our facts right, our arguments right. So I recommend people have a look at that. It's only 120 pages. That's by me, but its title is the Voice Referendum, a statement on behalf of the British Australian community. And that's just come out. That's also on Amazon as a Kindle and as a paperback. So I recommend people have a look at those books. We need to get our arguments right.
No, that's very important. Well, thank you again, Dr. Salter. It's been a pleasure hosting you, and I've also got another big interview coming up next week. So everyone watching, stay tuned for that, and keep up to date with everything that we're doing on our social media. As I said in the beginning, get off YouTube. I mean, they're just going to censor us. It's a waste of time. So thank you for everyone that's been watching in the Rumble. We've had a lot of comments coming through. This was a very interactive interview. A lot of people commenting on Facebook and Rumble. So thank you very much for that. And please share it out. I say it every single time. Share out these interviews because we can't just rely on the big social media companies and their algorithms. They more suppress us than promote us. So it's up to viewership to share these interviews out, get this information out, and it does make a big impact for people to do that. So thank you all very much. Thanks to everyone for watching, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Steve.